Welcome back, food lovers, to another deep dive into the culinary wonders of the world. I am Hari, and joining me as always is my brilliant co-host, Kimmy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Hari. I am so incredibly excited about today's topic. We are talking about a dish that is held in such high regard in its hometown that several writers have dubbed it the Queen of Sauces. We are talking about Neapolitan Ragù.
The Queen of Sauces indeed. Now, when a lot of people outside of Italy hear the word ragu, they immediately picture ragu alla bolognese, the meat sauce from Bologna that you typically eat with long, flat pasta like tagliatelle. But Neapolitan ragu is a completely different beast, isn't it?
It absolutely is. First off, it is a labor of love. Neapolitan ragu cooks for a much longer time than bolognese, and the ingredients are quite different. While bolognese uses minced meat and heavily relies on celery and carrot, the Neapolitan version uses massive whole pieces of meat. It also features way more tomato, and it is traditionally served with short, ridged pastas like ziti or macaroni.
That difference in the meat changes the entire structure of the meal. In the Italian meal structure, Neapolitan ragu is actually served in two distinct stages. It's essentially a two-for-one deal.
Exactly. The first stage is the primo course. You take that deeply flavored, incredibly rich tomato sauce that has been braising the meat all day, and you serve it over your short pasta. Maybe top it with some fresh basil and a grating of local pecorino cheese. Then comes the secondo course. The large pieces of meat are removed from the pot and eaten either entirely on their own or with a side of vegetables, just lightly dressed with whatever sauce is left.
It is such a brilliant way to stretch a dish. But what fascinates me most is that despite the heavy presence of tomato, locals in Naples fundamentally consider this a meat sauce or sugo di carne. The tomato is really just there as a conduit to carry all those intense braised meat flavors.
That local reverence is so deep that they even have their own name for it in the Neapolitan language. They call it ragù. And Hari, the origin story of that name is wild. There is an actual 14th century legend tied to this dish.
Oh, I love a good food myth. Please, tell me about the legend of Ragù.
So, the story goes back to the late 1300s. There was a religious association known as the Company of the Whites of Justice. They were traveling around Naples, preaching peace and begging people to reconcile with their enemies. They eventually arrived at the palace of a very cruel lord named Filippo d'Anjou. He was incredibly stubborn and refused to let go of his grudges.
Let me guess. It takes a miracle to change his mind?
A literal miracle. His 3-month-old infant son, whose name was Ragù, suddenly crossed his tiny arms and spoke, repeatedly shouting, "Mercy and peace." To calm her husband's rage after this shock, his wife prepared a dish of pasta, but through divine providence, the pasta was completely covered in blood.
Wow, okay, that took a rather dark turn for a cooking show.
Right? But the Lord was so deeply moved by this bloody miracle that he finally gave up his anger and forgave his enemies. Seeing his change of heart, his wife made the sauce again. This time, instead of blood, a vibrant, delicious red liquid appeared on top of the pasta. The Lord tasted it, found it absolutely incredible, and named the dish after his miraculous infant son, Ragù.
That is an incredible piece of folklore. Though, historically speaking, the real origins are a bit more French, aren't they? The name actually derives from the French ragout, which was introduced to Italy in the late 17th century.
Yes, the historical truth is slightly less miraculous, but totally fascinating. For the first 200 years of their existence, French ragouts were basically a class of sauces meant to flavor plain meat. They would brown meat and vegetables in fat, braise them in broth, and thicken it all with flour. By 1662, this concept reached northern Italy.
And the ingredients back then were absolutely nothing like the ragu we know today. A chef named Bartolomeo Stefani wrote about a ragu made from egg yolks, lemon juice, mastic, and veal kidney fat. Within about 30 years, the dish made its way down to Naples under the name ragu.
And the Neapolitan iterations were just as wild. A steward named Antonio Latini described a recipe featuring a stuffed cut of veal served with a separate sauce that included asparagus, sweetbreads, truffles, and black cherries.
Black cherries and truffles in a ragu? That sounds like a Michelin star tasting menu experiment today. It wasn't until the late 18th century that we started seeing things resemble the modern dish. In 1773, a Neapolitan chef named Vincenzo Corrado published Il Cuoco Galante, the gallant cook. He gave a recipe for a baked pasta dish called a timballo, which included a meat gravy. This is one of the earliest examples of combining pasta and meat in one dish.
Exactly. And then in 1790, Francesco Leonardi described a dish called macaroni alla napolitana in his book, L'Appicio Moderno. Food historians call his sauce an embryonic Neapolitan ragu, though Leonardi was still using ingredients like champagne, chicken combs, and unlaid eggs in his broader ragu recipes.
Unlaid eggs. The history of food is never boring. But the real game changer happened around 1807 when the second edition of Leonardi's book updated that macaroni recipe to include tomatoes. Food historian Massimo Montanari suggests the tomato edition probably started with the general population and eventually worked its way up to the aristocracy.
And by 1828, a cookbook called La Cucina Casereccia, or homemade cooking, published a recipe for pasta and ragu that is strikingly close to the modern version, even specifically recommending serving it over grated cheese. But despite the word homemade, this was still food for the rich. Meat was incredibly expensive for the poor in southern Italy.
Right. Most families could only afford meat a few times a year, usually around major holidays. Because Neapolitan ragu was so costly and time-consuming, it became heavily associated with the Sunday lunch. That tradition of the Sunday ragu is something that has survived to this day.
Let's talk about the cooking process, because that time-consuming nature is a massive part of the dish's identity. Traditional Neapolitan ragu is known for taking a remarkably long time to cook. Before World War II, families cooked it in pottery over unreliable coal fires, which meant someone had to constantly watch and stir it.
That gave birth to my favorite nickname for it, sugo della guardaporta, or the doorkeeper's sauce. The joke was that only a doorkeeper would have the free time necessary to sit there and watch a pot all day.
I love that. And there's a specific Neapolitan word for the way it cooks, pepiare. It is an onomatopoeia for the sound of the thick sauce bubbling and breaking at the surface over a very low heat. It has to cook below a simmer to achieve that dramatic flavor transformation and deep color shift.
And the choice of meat is entirely up to the cook and their location, which I find really interesting. In the countryside around Naples, they might use water buffalo. In Benevento, they use lamb. Up in the Salerno Mountains, they use goat. But the classic choices tend to be tough cuts that need those long hours to tenderize. Beef shoulder, beef shins, and pork short ribs.
Pork really gained prominence in the second half of the 20th century. You'll often see sausages added, or something called codica, which is pork skin that gets rolled tightly around garlic, raisins, parsley, and pine nuts, and then drops into the sauce to soften over hours.
That sounds incredibly rich, though modern recipes have lightened up a bit. Back in the day, they used olive oil, rendered lard, unrendered lard, and sometimes even butter all in one pot. By the 1990s, a lighter style emerged where chefs used very little fat, letting the meat speak for itself. And we can't forget the tomato paste. Older preparations used conserva, which was a deep red paste made by salting, milling, and sun-drying tomatoes. Some purists in Naples will tell you that a homemade tomato paste, alongside local Vesuvius wine and specific wooden spoons, is what separates a good ragu from a great one.
Purists take this very seriously. There's a famous 1947 poem written by Eduardo Di Filippo in the Neapolitan dialect called O Ragù. In it, a husband complains to his wife that because she didn't follow his mother's exact recipe, she hasn't made true ragu, she's merely made meat with tomatoes.
Ouch, the shade! That poem was actually adapted into a play and later in 1990 film starring Sophia Loren, where she famously argues with the butcher and other customers about the right way to make the dish. People get deeply emotional over their family's secret recipes.
It truly is the bedrock of the family Sunday. But the story of Neapolitan Ragù doesn't end in Italy. In the late 19th century, millions of Italians emigrated to North America, and they brought their queen of sauces with them.
And what they found in America was a total game changer: cheap meat. The poor immigrants who could previously only afford meat on rare holidays suddenly found they could have it every single Sunday. The ragu adapted into what Italian Americans often call Sunday gravy.
Exactly. They still maintained the two-course tradition for a while, serving the sauce over pasta first and the meat second. But as they incorporated more cuts like salt pork, veal, and braciuola, which is beef stuffed with ham, breadcrumbs, and cheese, the dish began to evolve.
The most famous evolution, of course, is spaghetti and meatballs. Early 20th century immigrants substituted the large chunks of braised meat with giant balls of minced meat. And instead of serving it in two courses, they piled it all on top of a mountain of spaghetti as a single massive dish.
Which was completely foreign to traditional Italian cooking. Some sources suggest that serving huge meatballs on top of pasta as a single course was popularized by restaurant economics and the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s, though the dish actually evolved decades earlier, between 1880 and 1920, as Italian immigrants adapted Neapolitan Ragù to utilize America's affordable and abundant meat.
It is fascinating how Neapolitan Ragù directly gave birth to the ultimate Italian-American comfort food.
It really is. From aristocratic French stews with black cherries, to a bloody miracle in a 14th century palace, to the doorkeeper's slow-simmering Sunday pot, and finally to the American Sunday gravy, it is a sauce that has literally conquered the world.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I am officially starving now, Kimmy. I think I need to go find a terracotta pot and start braising some beef shins.
Save some for me, Hari. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this delicious journey today. We hope your next Sunday lunch is as rich and comforting as a bowl of ziti covered in rau.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep eating. This episode is based on the Wikipedia article Neapolitan Ragù, which is available under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. This podcast was crafted using artificial intelligence.